Choice in history often appears only after geography has already narrowed the path. What later generations describe as strategy or ambition frequently emerges from quieter forces that shaped movement long before decisions were made. Along the Mediterranean, power rarely began in palaces or councils. It accumulated where distance shortened, where cargo paused, and where winds allowed ships to move reliably between coasts. The sea itself did not determine outcomes, but the corridors surrounding it steadily arranged the possibilities available to those living beside it. Over centuries, trade routes threaded through this basin like tension lines across a surface. Where those lines tightened, influence followed. Where they shifted, authority drifted with them. The Mediterranean is not a single open body of water, but a basin divided by coasts, islands, and narrow passages that interrupt movement. To the west, the Strait of Gibraltar compresses the sea into a narrow opening barely 14 kilometers wide. In the east, the Aegean fractures into hundreds of islands that slow travel and redirect routes through predictable channels. The northern shoreline stretches in long arcs broken by river mouths, the Rhône, the Po, the Ebro, each offering a path inland, but only where terrain permits. To the south, the coastline runs in long, sparse lines, interrupted by a few natural harbors. Distance across the basin appears short on a map, yet wind systems and seasonal currents determine when ships can cross it safely. Between Sicily and North Africa, currents compress traffic through a narrow band of navigable water. Farther east, the Levantine coast forms the last maritime step before land routes continue toward Asia. These physical constraints form a map of pressures rather than possibilities. Movement across this environment rarely followed the shortest line. Cargo left one harbor only when wind patterns allowed departure, and the safest routes often required ships to hug coastlines where shelter could be found before storms arrived. Grain traveling from the Nile Delta toward northern shores rarely crossed the open center of the basin. Instead, it moved in segments, along the Egyptian coast, past Cyprus, then westward through island chains that reduced exposure to sudden weather. Distance expanded into stages. Along these routes, waiting became a structural condition. Harbors filled not with dramatic arrivals, but with cargo paused between winds. Warehouses formed near docks, where merchants stored amphorae of oil, grain sacks, timber bundles, and metal ingots until the next segment of travel opened. Labor adjusted to these rhythms. Dock workers shifted schedules around wind windows. Carters hauled goods inland when ships could not sail. Over time, repeated waiting points hardened into infrastructure. Harbors deepened, breakwaters extended farther into the sea. Storage districts expanded behind port walls. None of this emerged from a single directive. It accumulated where routes repeatedly paused. The geography of delay gradually turned into geography of concentration. Further east, the Levantine coast functioned as a hinge between sea and land. Caravans arriving from interior deserts met ships already aligned with Mediterranean wind systems. Spices, textiles, and metals shifted from camel packs into maritime cargo. The transfer was slow and precise. Porters weighed loads, recorded quantities, and repacked goods to survive weeks of salt air and shifting decks. Distance reorganized itself at these shorelines. Once cargo entered the Mediterranean network, it followed corridors shaped by both geography and habit. Island chains created stepping stones that reduced navigational risk. Ships traveled from harbor to harbor rather than striking across open water. Every repeated stop reinforced the same pattern. Roads expanded inland from ports that received the most consistent traffic. Grain markets stabilized near harbors that handled predictable deliveries. Settlements grew around these rhythms. Small differences in travel time gradually produced wider structural consequences. A harbor positioned one day closer to prevailing winds could dispatch ships earlier in the season. That earlier departure allowed cargo to reach distant markets before competitors arrived. Merchants waiting in inland cities began favoring the ports that delivered reliably first. Warehouses filled faster in those locations. Shipbuilders relocated where hulls could find immediate work. The pattern repeated quietly. Timber shipments traveled from forested regions toward shipyards positioned near reliable routes. Rope makers, sail weavers, and metalworkers clustered around those yards. A port that once served as a simple stop along a route slowly transformed into a logistical center capable of sustaining larger fleets. None of these adjustments required coordination. They followed the path carved by accumulated movement. Elsewhere, distance produced the opposite effect. Ports slightly removed from these corridors experienced irregular arrivals. Storage buildings remained half full. Workers waited longer between cargo transfers. Traders began diverting shipments toward routes where the timing of winds and currents reduced uncertainty. Over decades, traffic thinned. The Mediterranean therefore contained a shifting lattice of pressure points. Certain straits compressed movement into narrow passages where every vessel eventually passed. Certain islands offered the last safe harbor before open crossings. Certain coastal plains provided the agricultural surplus that sustained dense port populations. When these features aligned, when surplus, shelter, and route convergence overlapped, concentration followed. Consider the narrow waters between Sicily and the North African coast. Ships traveling from eastern ports toward western markets often crossed this channel. Seasonal currents pushed vessels toward predictable arcs that converged near the same anchorages. Harbors there did not need to command the sea. They simply received what the currents delivered. Over time, storage facilities multiplied along these shores, accommodating cargo that paused while crews waited for the next favorable wind. From these pauses emerged redistribution. Goods arriving from the east could be divided, repacked, and redirected toward northern or western destinations. Smaller ships carried portions of cargo along shorter coastal routes, where deeper vessels could not safely travel. Labor adapted accordingly. Dock workers specialized in rapid unloading to reduce the time ships spent idle at anchor. Farther north, river mouths extended the reach of these maritime flows into continental interiors. Barges collected goods from sea-going vessels and carried them upstream where roads branched into distant markets. The process was slow but dependable. Grain sacks moved from ship holds to riverboats, then from riverbanks onto wagons pulled across valleys and plains. Every transfer extended the influence of the original route. Yet the same structure that concentrated movement also exposed its rigidity. When winds shifted seasonally, entire networks paused. Warehouses filled faster than ships could depart. Workers shifted from loading cargo to maintaining vessels. Inland markets adjusted their expectations, stretching stored supplies across longer intervals between deliveries. Recognition of these constraints eventually surfaced. Merchants charted routes with increasing precision. Navigators recorded seasonal wind patterns, seeking slight improvements in timing. Ports attempted to deepen harbors or extend protective walls to attract passing ships. The adjustments were visible, deliberate even. But they occurred within boundaries the sea had already drawn. A question quietly emerged within the structure itself. If trade routes determined which harbors accumulated infrastructure and which settlements expanded beside them, what would happen if the routes changed? Not by decision, but by distance, climate variation, or new corridors elsewhere. Infrastructure could not move easily. Warehouses, shipyards, and road networks anchored entire regions to patterns that might no longer hold. Across the Mediterranean, Stone docks remained fixed, even as currents and commerce slowly rearranged their paths. Ships continued to sail, cargo continued to pass through straits and island chains, and workers continued adapting their labor to the rhythm of arrivals and departures. Yet beneath that activity, the deeper structure persisted. The sea did not declare winners or losers. It simply narrowed movement into corridors where repetition created concentration. Once those corridors shifted, even slightly, the weight of accumulated infrastructure revealed its inertia. Ports built for one pattern of movement faced another. And along the same coasts where warehouses once filled quickly with cargo from distant shores, workers sometimes waited longer between sails appearing on the horizon, listening to winds that no longer carried the same traffic they once did. If this reflection resonated with you, you can find more explorations like this on Timeless Questions, where history, power, and human nature quietly intersect.